They stabbed him, poisoned him, shot him, drowned him, and he still wouldn't die. On a freezing December night in 1916, a group of Russian nobles dragged a body from the icy waters of the Neva River. The corpse was battered, swollen, eyes wide open, frozen in an expression of fury and disbelief. But here's the part that chilled them to the bone. There was water in his lungs, meaning he was still alive when they threw him in. Grigori Rasputin wasn't just a man. He was an obsession, a disease, a prophecy. A peasant who whispered to emperors, slept with nobility, and walked through fire like a ghost dressed in flesh. Some called him holy, others called him the devil. But no one could ignore him. And the more they tried to kill him, the louder his legend screamed back from the grave. This is the story of the man who refused to die. The man whose death came too late to save an empire, and just early enough to curse it. He was born in the cold, January 1869, Siberia. Not the Siberia people talk about in stories, but the real one, where the ground stays frozen 9 months a year, and wolves howl like ghosts from the edge of the trees. His name was Grigori Yefimovich. Born in a village called Pokrovskoye, a place where horses were more important than books, and no one ever left. He didn't cry much as a baby, didn't laugh either. He just stared. The midwife said he had the eyes of a grown man, quiet, watchful, a little wrong. His family were peasants. Dirt under the nails, frostbite in the toes, soup made of bones and cabbage. His father, Yefim, was a coachman who drank too much. His mother, Anna, was silent like the snow, present but fading. They had 7 children. 5 died young, drowning, pneumonia. 1 just vanished in the woods. But Grigori survived. And that, some said, was the first miracle. He was a strange child, didn't play with others, wandered off into the woods for hours, sometimes days. He claimed he could talk to animals, that trees whispered things when the wind blew just right. The villagers whispered back. They said he had the second sight, that he saw things no child should see. One day, he stared at a man's leg and said, "You'll lose that foot by winter." The man laughed, until an axe slipped during woodcutting, and the frost finished what the blade began. The church grew wary, his parents grew scared, and still he wandered. At age 10, he saw his first vision. He was lying in bed with a fever, muttering nonsense, sweating through his sheets. Then suddenly, he sat up, eyes wide, silent. Later, he said the Virgin Mary had come to him. Said she showed him a door made of stars. Said he could step through it if he wanted. He didn't. But from that night on, he changed. He started to twitch during prayer, to shake, to moan like he was touched by something bigger than himself. They thought it was epilepsy, then demons, then divine inspiration. They couldn't decide what scared them more. He refused to go to school, couldn't read, couldn't write. But he spoke like someone who had read 100 ancient books, like someone who wasn't speaking for himself. He didn't need teachers. He had voices. At 17, he was caught stealing a horse, a serious crime. But instead of punishment, he was sent away to a monastery. There, among the icons and incense, he discovered something far more powerful than prayer. he discovered power. Not the kind that wears a crown, the kind that comes from awe, from fear, from making people believe that you know something they don't. He fasted, whipped himself, walked barefoot in the snow until his feet bled. He became addicted, not to God, but to the feeling of people watching. Some monks said he was touched by grace. Others whispered he was faking it all. Then one day, he left, just walked away from the monastery. No goodbyes, no explanation. He returned to his village, married, had children. But the hunger, it didn't leave him. He began traveling from village to village, preaching, healing, touching the sick, listening to women's secrets. Some said he had the gift. Others said he had wandering hands. But then came the moment, the one no one forgot. A child in the village fell ill, high fever, skin red like fire. Doctors said he wouldn't last the night. The mother begged Rasputin to come. He did, quietly, no chants, no relics, just his hands. He placed his palm on the child's chest, closed his eyes, and whispered. The fever broke by morning. The boy lived, and the village would never see Rasputin the same way again. They called him a starets, a holy man. They gave him bread, shelter, wine. He never charged. He didn't have to. Word spread like wildfire through the snows of Siberia. There's a man who walks through blizzards with no coat, who heals without medicine, who sees what's inside your soul. He wasn't rich, wasn't educated, wasn't clean, but he was something else. He was magnetic, terrifying, holy, and he was coming for more, because Rasputin had tasted what it meant to be feared. He arrived in St. Petersburg like a shadow that slipped in under the door. No title, no shoes, just a long beard, filthy robes, and a stare that made people forget what they were saying. It was 1905. Russia was burning from the inside. Bloody uprisings, food riots, and the monarchy cracking like ice under pressure. The people were starving. Soldiers were deserting. And in the middle of it all, the Tsar and Tsarina were praying for a miracle. They got Rasputin. He was introduced to the capital's elite through whispers. First, it was a countess, then a duchess. They said he had the power to cleanse souls, to pull demons from wombs, to heal the bleeding inside a woman's body with nothing but his voice. He would walk into a candle-lit salon, reeking of unwashed clothes and forest smoke, and somehow, every woman in the room would lower her gaze. They said he didn't blink, that when he stared, it felt like your bones were being read like scripture. To some, it was terrifying. To others, intoxicating. One night, he was brought to a palace. Not the palace, but close. And there, he met her. Alexandra Fyodorovna, the Tsarina of Russia. She was pale, fragile, eyes heavy with sleeplessness and worry. Her son, the heir to the throne, was dying. The boy, Alexei, had hemophilia, a paper-thin disease of the blood. If he fell, he bled inside. If he bled inside, he could die. And that night, he had fallen. The doctors had tried everything. Morphine, ice packs, prayers. Nothing worked. So the Tsarina did something desperate. She called Rasputin. He walked in slowly, hands folded. Didn't bow, didn't ask questions. He looked at the child, unconscious and whimpering. He placed a hand on the boy's chest, and whispered. No one knows what he said. Some say he told the blood to return to its place. Some say he simply told the doctors to leave. But by morning, Alexei's fever was gone. The bleeding stopped. He lived. Alexandra wept. She didn't see a peasant. She saw an angel, a man sent by God to protect her child, her future. From that moment on, Rasputin belonged to the royal family. He wasn't given a title. He didn't live in the palace. But his name, his presence, lingered in every hallway, in every decision. When ministers were appointed, he was consulted. When wars were planned, he was heard. When Alexandra wrote to her husband, she signed her letters with a final plea. Our friend says everything will be all right. Our friend. Not priest, not prophet, but more. Rasputin did what he always did. He watched, he whispered, and he waited. While the nobility scoffed at his rags, the empress clung to his every word. While generals plotted battles, Rasputin plotted something deeper, faith through fear. He told Alexandra that only he could keep Alexei alive, that only he had the divine favor to protect the heir, and that if he were to die, Russia would follow. It was a bold claim, but she believed him. Outside the palace gates, the rumors started to spread like wildfire. That Rasputin was sleeping with the empress, that he bathed in wine and beat servants, that he laughed at the church and mocked the nobility, that he was the real ruler of Russia, and maybe he was. But Rasputin didn't care what they said. He was needed. That was power. He had the ear of the most powerful woman in the empire. He had the future Tsar's life tied to the rhythm of his own breath. And then came the second miracle. A few months later, Alexei suffered another hemorrhage, worse than before. The doctors said he would not survive the night. Alexandra was hysterical. Nicholas was away. No one knew where Rasputin was. Then, someone remembered. He had gone to his home in Siberia. There was no time to send for him. So Alexandra wrote. A desperate telegram sent across thousands of miles of ice and snow. That night, Rasputin received the message. He sat by candlelight. He read it. And then he wrote back. Don't let the doctors disturb him too much. The boy will not die. God has seen your tears. He will be healed tomorrow. The letter arrived in St. Petersburg the next morning. And with it, Alexei's condition improved. His fever dropped. The bleeding stopped. No medicine, no reason, just a letter and a miracle. From that day on, Rasputin was no longer just our friend. He was the lifeline, the man who kept the empire breathing. They tried to hide him, tried to deny him. But Rasputin didn't need a crown. He had the next best thing, a mother's love. At first, he kept a low profile. He lived modestly, visited the palace quietly, never pushed too hard. But Rasputin couldn't stay quiet for long. He was never meant to be invisible, not when the world was watching. Soon he began appearing in salons, at opera houses, sometimes drunk, sometimes barefoot. He spoke in riddles, told nobles their sins, told women their secrets, and they listened, or they pretended not to. Either way, he was inside their heads. He grew bolder. He started visiting brothels, walking through the front door like a priest entering church. He called it spiritual cleansing. But the whispers were louder than his excuses. They said he slept with married noblewomen, seduced their daughters, held prayer circles where the prayers ended in moans. There was a darkness growing around him. Not just gossip, but fear. The kind of fear that doesn't scream. The kind that watches, that waits. Some women swore he had hypnotic powers. That once you looked into his eyes, you forgot your name. That he made them do things they'd never speak of again. One said she dreamt of him every night, even after he spat in her face. Another said he put his hands on her belly and told her she was barren. And then she bled for 3 days straight. He was no longer a mystic. He was a myth. Half man, half nightmare. And yet, no one could touch him. Because every time the court tried to speak out, every time a minister raised concern, Alexei would fall ill, and Rasputin would heal him again and again and again. The Empress clung to him like a dying woman clings to a flame. She said he was God's gift. She said he was the only man who truly understood Russia. She called him Father Grigori. She signed her letters with crosses and love. She saw him as holy. But the people saw something else. They saw rot, a stinking wound in the heart of the empire. Newspapers began printing cartoons, Rasputin towering over the Tsar, and Tsarina like a puppet master. His beard soaked in wine, his hands wrapped around the crown. The nobility was horrified. How could a filthy peasant from Siberia, illiterate, unwashed, hold such sway? How could they serve a Tsar who bowed to a madman? Some believed Rasputin was a German spy. Some thought he was possessed. But most agreed on one thing. He had to go. He interfered with ministerial appointments. He ousted generals. He meddled with war strategy. He replaced competent men with fools because they listened to him, not logic. And every failure on the battlefield, every drop of Russian blood spilled in World War I, was whispered back to one name: Rasputin. In 1915, the Tsar made a fatal mistake. He left the capital to take personal command of the army. That meant the government was in the hands of Alexandra, and Alexandra was in the hands of Rasputin. For the nobility, this wasn't just scandal. It was treason. It wasn't just a holy man gone mad. It was Russia's destiny being hijacked by a man who smelled like goats and sin. One day, a duchess saw him slap a servant. Another day, a nobleman's wife confessed she had miscarried after Rasputin laid his hands on her. And still, he walked freely. Because the Tsarina said he was untouchable. Because the Tsarina believed he was sent by heaven. That belief, more than anything, is what doomed them. Because belief turns to obsession. Obsession turns to hatred. And hatred turns to murder. In late 19th, a young noble named Prince Felix Yusupov began to plot. He watched Rasputin closely, watched how he walked, how he drank, how he stared at women as if undressing their souls. He studied the man like a beast and came to a conclusion: he's not going to stop. Not until we make him. They said he was rotting before he died. That his breath stank of decay. That his teeth turned black from within. That his skin grew gray and loose, like a corpse preparing itself. And yet, he lived. He still walked the halls of palaces, still whispered into the ears of queens, still sent shivers through the spines of generals. But underneath the beard, under the robes, under the power, something was wrong. His health had always been strange. Some days he glowed with energy. Others he collapsed in exhaustion, babbling about demons in the walls. He drank constantly, ate barely anything. He began to sweat through his robes, even in the snow. His eyes looked red, like blood had soaked into the whites. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't stop trembling. He claimed God spoke to him at night and screamed at him by morning. Doctors offered to examine him. He refused. He didn't trust them. They serve the Germans, he said. They serve the devil. But it wasn't paranoia that tried to kill Rasputin first. It was a woman. July 19, France, 14. A small village called Pokrovskoye, his birthplace. Rasputin had returned home for a brief rest, or maybe to remind himself of where he began. He was walking through the street, relaxed. No guards, no followers, just the summer dust and the weight of his reputation. Then she struck. A woman rushed from the crowd, her eyes wide, her hands trembling. She screamed something no one understood. And then she stabbed him, right in the gut. The knife tore through his abdomen, ripped into his stomach. His intestines spilled out, red, raw, steaming in the air. He collapsed in the dirt. People screamed, horses reared. The woman laughed. Her name was Kayonia Guseva, a former follower, a religious fanatic, or maybe a warning from fate itself. She said, "I have killed the Antichrist." But Rasputin didn't die. They rushed him into a barn, held his intestines in place with their hands. He muttered prayers, or curses, or both. He lay on a wooden table for hours, slipping in and out of consciousness. A priest anointed him, assuming he'd pass. But he didn't. He survived the night. He survived the next day and the next. For weeks, he was between life and death. Doctors thought the wound would turn gangrenous. But it didn't. They waited for fever, for infection, for the smell of rot. But it never came. Instead, Rasputin healed. Not well, not clean, but alive. The scar across his belly never closed properly. He walked hunched over after that, groaning, clutching his gut. Sometimes his robes would bleed from the inside. Sometimes he'd vomit during conversation and keep talking as if nothing happened. He grew thinner, more twisted, more unnatural. People said he looked like something that had crawled out of the grave and forgot to lie back down. But his power didn't fade. In fact, his influence deepened. They said surviving a wound like that proved he was holy. That the devil couldn't kill him. That God wouldn't let him go. His enemies saw something else. They saw a walking corpse, held together by force of will and black magic. He began to say strange things. "I have seen the grave," he told the Tsarina. "I have touched my own death, and it was cold, but it knew me." He told her he could see the future, and what he saw was blood. He warned that war would bring ruin, that Russia would drown in its own soil. They didn't listen, because they couldn't tell the difference between prophecy and madness anymore. Then came the seizures. In the middle of dinners, he would convulse, knock over glasses, smash plates. He would speak in tongues, speak to no one. Sometimes he'd whisper things no one understood. Sometimes He'd shout names of people who had just died in other cities. No one knew how he knew. The servants began to fear him. They said his shadow didn't move the same way he did. That he talked to mirrors, that rats followed him in the hallway. And still, Alexei lived. As long as the boy lived, Rasputin could do no wrong in the eyes of the Tsarina. But the nobles? They watched this half-dead man stumble from room to room. They watched the Empress sob when he left the palace. They watched the Tsar ignore the government while Rasputin whispered prophecy. And they made a decision. If the devil wears a beard, then let the devil bleed. Rasputin no longer walked like a man. He staggered. Every step was a struggle. His body broken, scarred, stitched from within. But his eyes still burned. Not with life, not with faith, but with something darker. Fear. By late 1916, Rasputin had stopped sleeping. He said shadows watched him from the corners of his room. Said voices followed him into the bath. Said mirrors no longer showed his face. He paced the halls of his house at night, muttering names, some living, some dead. He stopped eating solid food, said it tasted like ash. He drank wine, only wine, from sunrise to well past midnight. He laughed when no one spoke, screamed when no one moved. His letters to the Tsarina grew erratic, the handwriting crooked, the words frantic. Sometimes they were prayers, other times, warnings. He told her he felt a black river rising beneath the palace, that the wolves are circling and they are dressed like men. The nobility was circling. That part was true. But Rasputin didn't trust anyone anymore. Not the servants, not the priests, not even the guards at the palace gate. He accused them of plotting, of poisoning his food, of hiding weapons in the curtains. He began refusing to enter certain rooms, refused to let anyone walk behind him, refused to sleep unless his door was nailed shut. One day, he walked into the Empress's chamber and fell to his knees. He clutched her feet, trembling, eyes wet. "They are going to kill me," he whispered. "Your Grace, they will kill me like a dog in the snow." She tried to calm him, told him he was safe, that no one would dare. He looked up at her with glassy eyes. "If they do, the throne will bleed." That same week, he sat down and wrote a letter to Nicholas II, the Tsar himself. It was not a letter of loyalty, not advice. It was a prophecy. "I feel I shall leave life before January. If I am murdered by common men, your throne shall stand for centuries. But if I am killed by your own kin, then the empire will crumble. Your sons will be slaughtered, your daughters shot. The name Romanov will burn in the snow." He sealed the letter, sent it with trembling hands, and waited. The Tsar never responded. Some say he read it and laughed. Others say he read it and quietly folded it away, not knowing it would come true in less than 2 years. Rasputin's visions worsened. He began claiming he saw blood running down the palace walls, that the chandeliers dripped with fat instead of wax, that in his dreams he saw the Empress nailed to a cross made of gold, while her son drowned in a sea of red silk. His paranoia turned violent. One night, a maid forgot to knock. He lunged at her, thinking she was an assassin. He was pulled off, shouting, "She wears death in her eyes!" Another time, he stood in the snow for hours, outside the palace, barefoot, arms outstretched, eyes to the stars. When a guard asked what he was doing, he whispered, "I'm waiting for the bullet." He stopped bathing, said water betrayed him. He smelled like old wine and dried blood, like death on its way in and decay on its way out. And still, he was protected. The Empress refused to believe he was losing his mind. She said he was closer to God now than ever. That suffering brought him visions. That pain made his prayers stronger. The more he unraveled, the more she believed. The nobles, meanwhile, stopped plotting in whispers. They began preparing. They watched Rasputin spiral deeper and deeper into madness, and saw their opportunity rising like steam from a winter grave. One night, he told a friend, "They won't shoot me like a soldier. They'll poison me like a rat." The friend asked, "Who?" Rasputin didn't answer. He just stared into the fire and whispered, "They're already here." It happened in winter. Of course it did. The streets were quiet. The snow swallowed every sound. December 16th, 1916. The night Russia tried to kill the man it feared the most. The plan was simple. Poison him. If that failed, shoot him. If that failed, beat him. And if that failed, pray he stayed dead. The conspirators were led by Prince Felix Yusupov, young, wealthy, married to a Romanov, beautiful and cold as polished ice. He hated Rasputin. But more than that, he feared him, feared what he represented, the decay of the empire from within. So he invited Rasputin to his palace, told him there was a party, music, women, wine, told him the Tsarina had asked him to come. Rasputin, curious as ever, agreed. The palace basement was prepared. One table, one glass of wine, one plate of petit four laced with cyanide. Enough poison to kill 5 men. Rasputin arrived late. He looked tired, sick, half dead already, but his eyes still gleamed like embers under ash. They offered him wine. He drank. He ate the cakes, slowly, chewed, swallowed, and waited. Nothing happened. 5 minutes, 10, 20. He laughed, asked for more. Yusupov began to panic. He left the room, ran upstairs, found his co-conspirators. "I gave him enough poison to kill a horse," he whispered. "Then kill him like a man," someone said. He returned with a revolver. Rasputin stood near the table, humming, looking at the ceiling. Yusupov raised the gun and fired. The bullet hit Rasputin in the chest. He collapsed. Face first, motionless, blood pooled. Silence fell. They waited 5 minutes, then 10, then... Yusupov leaned in to check the body, and Rasputin's eyes snapped open. He lunged, screaming, foam at the mouth, blood spraying from his wound. He clawed at Yusupov's throat, dragged himself up the stairs, burst into the courtyard, running, with a hole in his chest. The other conspirators rushed outside, fired again and again. 2 more bullets hit him, one in the back, one in the head. He fell, hard, into the snow. They surrounded him, kicked him, beat him with iron rods, then wrapped his body in chains, dragged it to the edge of the river. The Neva was frozen. They found a hole in the ice, a black mouth gaping in the silence. They dropped him in. The water swallowed him whole. It was done. Or so they thought. 3 days later, the body was recovered downstream. The skin was pale blue, frozen, cracked. But when the coroners examined him, they found something impossible. His arms were free. Scratches lined the underside of the ice. There was water in his lungs, which meant he was still alive when they threw him in. He hadn't drowned. He had clawed at the ice until his last breath, fought the river, fought death itself, and lost. Not to poison, not to bullets, not to blunt force, but to cold, to silence, to the weight of all the fear they'd poured into him. They say his face was twisted in rage, mouth open, eyes wide, as if death had taken him by surprise. The conspirators tried to destroy the body, tried to burn it, but the fire wouldn't take. It crackled, hissed, smoked, then died, as if even the flames refused to finish what they had started. They buried him in secret. Then, days later, dug him up again, burned what was left, scattered the ashes, lost the bones, trying to erase the evidence, trying to silence a scream that refused to stop echoing. But it didn't work, because Rasputin didn't die like a man. He died like a myth. And myths don't stay buried. They wait. When Rasputin died, the Russian elite breathed a sigh of relief. They thought they'd killed the cancer, that the infection had been burned out of the imperial body. But they were wrong. Because Rasputin wasn't the disease. He was the symptom, the warning. And by the time they buried his body, the rot had already spread too far. The Empress was the first to feel it. When she heard the news of his death, she didn't cry. She screamed. She locked herself in her chambers for days, clutching a portrait of Rasputin to her chest. She swore the walls were bleeding, that the chandeliers were shaking, that something had broken loose. The imperial court said she was grieving. But it was more than that. She was terrified. Because Rasputin had left her a warning. He said, "If I am killed by your kin, your throne will fall, your family will die, and none will remember your name with kindness." She believed him, and deep down, so did Nicholas. Weeks after the murder, Russia began to unravel. The war with Germany had gone from bad to catastrophic. The army was starving. The cities were boiling with riots. In Petrograd, women stormed bakeries. Men refused to join the draft. Factories shut down. Streets burned. And in the Winter Palace, silence. No strategy, no decisions, just the hollow echoes of a dying empire. The people no longer feared the crown because they no longer believed in it. In March 1917, it happened. Nicholas II was forced to abdicate. The last Tsar of Russia, the man descended from Peter the Great, was no longer emperor. He signed the paper with shaking hands. He wrote in his journal that night, "All around me is treason, cowardice, and deceit." But he was wrong. What surrounded him wasn't betrayal. It was consequence. The Romanov family was placed under house arrest. No more carriages, no more diamonds, no more bowing servants. Just cold rooms, thin soup, and the slow realization that history had already turned the page. They moved from palace to palace, each one smaller, dirtier, until they arrived in a town called Ekaterinburg. There, in a merchant's house stripped of luxury, they waited. Nicholas, Alexandra, their 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and their son, Alexei, the boy Rasputin had once saved. They waited for mercy. It never came. On the night of July 16, 1918, they were told to dress quickly, told to come downstairs for a photograph, to prove they were still alive. The room was small, the floor dusty. Nicholas held Alexei in his arms. Alexandra stood beside him. The girls lined up against the wall. And then, the door opened. A firing squad entered. No trial, no ceremony, just a command. "Shoot them all!" The room erupted in gunfire. Nicholas died first, shot through the head. Alexandra tried to cross herself, but a bullet shattered her skull. The girl screamed, fell. Some were still alive, hidden behind the jewels sewn into their corsets. The soldiers reloaded, stabbed, shot again. The floor was soaked with royal blood. The walls echoed with the last cries of a dynasty. When it was done, they carried the bodies to the forest, burned them, buried the bones in secret. For decades, no one knew where the Romanovs had fallen. No cross, no stone, just silence. But Rasputin had known. They killed him to save the empire. But within 18 months, the crown was gone. The throne emptied. The palaces looted. The family dead. Just as he said. Felix Yusupov, the man who helped murder Rasputin, later wrote, "We thought we were cleansing the country. Instead, we set fire to the house." In killing Rasputin, they didn't stop the collapse. They started it. Because some deaths aren't the end of the story. They're the curse that begins it. After the dynasty fell, the world looked back, and they saw Rasputin still there, still staring. Even in death, his shadow stretched across the ruins of empire. Some called him the devil of Russia, a drunken degenerate, a seducer of queens, a peasant who clawed his way to the throne with filth on his hands and blood in his teeth. They said he corrupted the Tsarina, that he destroyed the royal family from within, that he brought the empire to its knees. One whispered prayer at a time. Others called him a martyr, a holy fool, a mystic misunderstood, a scapegoat for a collapsing regime that couldn't face its own reflection. They said he healed the boy when no one else could, that he gave Alexandra something no one else could offer: hope. Historians divided into camps. One side painted him as a monster, greedy, manipulative, power-hungry. They pointed to the brothels, the orgies, the interference in politics, the wild letters from the Empress. Friend of the royal family became a euphemism for something darker. But the other side? They saw a deeper truth. Rasputin wasn't the disease. He was the symptom. He rose not because he schemed, but because the empire was already rotting. He didn't create the chaos. He stepped into it, into a world desperate for meaning, desperate for miracles, desperate for anyone who could pretend to offer answers. Russia in the early 1900s was a land bleeding from every corner. Famine, war, poverty, a monarchy out of touch and out of time. And in that chaos, people didn't want a general. They wanted a prophet. Someone who could whisper in God's voice. Someone who could touch a dying child and make the pain go away. Rasputin gave them that, even if it wasn't real. Was he manipulative? Yes. Was he crude? Absolutely. But he was also a reflection, a mirror held up to the palace. And what that mirror showed was terrifying. A dying monarchy, a desperate queen, a crumbling state. Rasputin didn't break the Romanovs. He revealed just how breakable they already were. He never wore a crown, but he held more power than most kings, not through armies, not through laws, through belief. And belief is the most dangerous weapon of all. Even today, scholars argue over who Rasputin really was. Was he truly healing Alexei? Or just benefiting from coincidence? Was he controlling the Tsarina? Or simply comforting her? Was he a madman? Or the only sane man in a palace full of delusion? His name became legend. Songs, novels, films, dancers dressed like him. Children feared him. Churches denied him. But no one could ignore him. In 1977, a disco song turned his name into a beat. Grigori Rasputin, lover of the Russian queen. He became kitsch, a punchline, a cartoon. But behind the music, behind the myth, behind the beard, was a real man. A man who walked barefoot in the snow, who talked to God and heard silence, who looked into the eyes of empresses and saw only fear. A man who survived poison, bullets, and betrayal, but couldn't survive the weight of what he had become. Maybe he was evil. Maybe he was blessed. Maybe he was just broken. But one thing is clear. He wasn't the monster. He was the mirror. When they pulled him from the river, he didn't look human. His skin was blue-gray, swollen. His face bloated, frozen into a grotesque scream. His eyes were still open, staring, not up, not down, straight ahead, as if he'd seen something on the other side, and it had terrified him. His hands were raised, frozen in a claw-like reach, fingernails cracked, palms bloodied, as if he'd fought the ice until his lungs collapsed. They tried to close his eyes. They wouldn't budge. The coroner's report was bizarre. He had water in his lungs, meaning he was still breathing when they threw him in. He had poison in his stomach, meaning he swallowed cyanide. He had 3 bullet wounds, 2 in the body, 1 in the forehead, and bruises on the head, broken ribs, split lips. He'd been beaten, shot, poisoned, drowned, and he still fought. Photographs were taken, not for remembrance, not for honor, but to prove he was finally dead. They dressed his corpse, propped him up in a chair, snapped a photo. You can find it if you search hard enough. The eyes are what haunt you. Still wide, still wild, still alive. One man said, "It looked like he was about to speak." Another swore he saw Rasputin's mouth twitch as they took the picture, like he was whispering to something only he could see. The body was ordered buried in secret. No grave, no tomb, no cross, just a shallow pit in the woods. But word got out, and less than 2 months later, his corpse was dug up. It was Alexandra who gave the order. She didn't want Rasputin's grave to become a shrine, didn't want pilgrims kneeling where he slept. So they dragged him from the ground, tossed him like garbage into a furnace, lit the fire, watched the flames eat his body, or tried to, because the fire wouldn't take. His clothes burned, his hair curled, but the skin sizzled, blackened, then smoldered. The smoke stank of wine and rot. And then something terrifying happened. As the flames rose, witnesses claimed he sat up. For a brief moment, the charred body lifted from the pyre, arms rising, back arching. Some said it was just gas, a reflex. Others swore it was something else. A final act, a curse made flesh. They shoved him back down, added more fuel, watched in horror until only ash remained. The ashes were scattered, the bones discarded. No monument was ever built, No statue, no plaque, no gravestone. The Romanovs had palaces, portraits, churches filled with gold and glass. Rasputin had nothing, and yet he's the one they never forgot. In time, the royal portraits faded. The Tsar's bloodline ended. The empire collapsed. But Rasputin, his name remained, etched in the mouth of every myth, in the ink of every conspiracy, in the nightmares of a nation that still couldn't explain him. They tried to erase him, but he never left. In every version of his death, a different Rasputin appears. The sorcerer, the prophet, the monster, the martyr. But the photos don't lie. And in the last one, his mouth is slightly open, his head tilted, like he's whispering something. To who? We'll never know. Maybe it was a final prayer, maybe a curse, maybe a name, or maybe he was laughing. They stabbed him, poisoned him, shot him, drowned him, and still, he wouldn't die. That's not just a story, that's a lesson about power, about fear, about what we bury and what refuses to stay buried. Grigori Rasputin was not a king. He wore no crown, commanded no armies. He was a peasant, a wanderer, a man whose robes stank of sweat and vodka. But he understood something that emperors forgot, that in a world of uncertainty, belief is everything. People didn't follow him because of who he was. They followed because of what he represented. To the Tsarina, he was salvation. To the court, he was corruption. To the people, he was everything wrong with the system. But to history, he became something more dangerous than any of that. He became unforgettable. Empires rise and fall, crowns rust, statues crumble. But the name Rasputin, it lingers in our songs, in our jokes, in our fears. And maybe that's what scares us the most. Not that he lived, but that he refused to die on cue. I think about him sometimes. About that night on the Neva River. The way the ice cracked. The way they dragged his body like garbage. The way he clawed at the underside of the ice, trying to breathe just once more. What kind of man fights that hard to stay alive? A madman? A prophet? A monster? Or just a man who knew that death would never give him peace? We like to believe we can control power, that we can kill the things we create, that if we stab them hard enough, shoot them enough times, drown them deep enough, they'll go away. But power isn't a body, it's a story. And stories don't drown. Rasputin wasn't immortal, but his fall, his grotesque, terrifying, unstoppable fall, that became legend. A warning etched into the frozen river of history. That when power festers, when faith is misplaced, when fear grows louder than truth, you don't get a revolution. You get a resurrection. You kill a man like Rasputin, and he comes back in mirrors, in whispers, in dreams. Because he was never just a man. He was what happens when we believe too blindly, hope too desperately, hold on to ghosts while the world collapses. In the end, they tried to burn his body, but they couldn't burn what he became. A curse, a parable, a name. Rasputin, the man they killed 4 times and still couldn't silence.